If you think being home alone means you're actually alone, think again. Because the 3 true stories you're about to hear might make you never want to stay home alone again. In the first story, who keeps knocking at the door when there's nobody outside? In the second, a college student walks away from her laptop for less than a minute. So who typed the message waiting for her when she came back? And in the final story, no voices, no knocks, just objects inside a bedroom, slowly moving on their own. Let's begin. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys watching horror movies alone. Honestly, that's part of what makes them fun for me. I'm 20 years old, and I've been obsessed with horror for as long as I can remember. It doesn't matter if it's supernatural, psychological, or just a good slasher. If it's horror, I'm watching it. I've stayed home alone plenty of times before, watched scary movies late at night, and never once felt uncomfortable. But after what happened to me last week, I don't think I'll ever do that again. My parents had to drive across town that evening and told me they'd be home pretty late, so I had the house to myself. Around 9 o'clock, I grabbed some snacks, dimmed the lights in the living room, and put on Lee Cronin's The Mummy. Everything felt completely normal. The house was quiet, the movie was great, and for about 40 minutes I didn't think about anything except what was happening on the screen. Then I heard 3 slow knocks at the front door. At first, I barely reacted. I paused the movie and listened for a few seconds expecting another knock, but the house went completely silent. I walked over to the front window, pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside, and checked the porch, the driveway, and even the sidewalk. There wasn't a single person there. The street looked exactly the way it always does at night. Quiet. Empty. I figured someone probably knocked on the wrong house, or maybe some neighborhood kid was messing around. So I shrugged it off, closed the curtain, and started the movie again. A minute or two later, I heard something that made my stomach drop. Someone quietly called my name. Not yelling, not whispering, just a normal voice, like someone standing outside wanted me to come to the door. I froze. I got up again and looked through the same window, scanning the porch, the driveway, and as far down the street as I could see. Nothing. There wasn't anyone outside, no cars, no people walking, no one hiding, just an empty street. At that point, I started telling myself the movie was probably getting into my head. It sounded ridiculous, but it was the only explanation that made any sense. I sat back down, trying to ignore how uneasy I suddenly felt. Then, the knocking came back. This time it was louder. 3 hard knocks that echoed through the entire house. I jumped up immediately and rushed back to the window because I was sure whoever knocked couldn't have gone very far. But once again, there was nobody there. That was the moment I stopped trying to convince myself everything was normal. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. My dad answered after a couple of rings, and I told him everything as quickly as I could. I explained that someone had knocked on the front door twice, and in between the knocks, I heard someone outside call my name. The strange part was that every time I looked outside, there wasn't a single person anywhere. He could tell from my voice that I wasn't joking anymore. He told me to keep every door locked, not to open the door no matter what, and said he and my mom were leaving immediately. The problem was, they were almost an hour away. After we hung up, I turned the TV off. At that point, I had completely lost interest in the movie. I walked through the house one more time, checking every door and every window just to make sure everything was locked. Even knowing that, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still outside watching the house. I went upstairs to my room and sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand, counting down the minutes until my parents got home. The house was completely silent now. Without the TV in the background, every little noise seemed louder than it should have been. I kept staring at the bedroom door, then back at my phone, trying to convince myself I was just letting the movie get into my head. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Someone calmly called my name from outside. I got up immediately and walked over to the bedroom window. I looked across the porch, the driveway, the sidewalk, and as far down the street as I could see. There wasn't anyone there. No cars driving by. No neighbors outside. Nothing. I stayed there for another few seconds before stepping away from the window, trying to tell myself I was imagining things. The second I sat back down, 3 loud knocks hit the front door again. I rushed straight back to the window, because I was sure whoever knocked couldn't have gotten very far in just a few seconds. The porch was empty. The driveway was empty. Then my eyes drifted farther down the street toward the darkest part of the block where the streetlight barely reached. That's when I saw it. A dark figure standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out a face or even tell if it was a man or a woman. It wasn't moving at all. Then one thought hit me immediately. If that thing had just knocked on my front door, how could it already be standing that far away? I just stood there, staring at that figure. I don't even know how long it was. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. It never moved. It never waved. It just stood there in the darkness, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. Then I noticed headlights turning onto my street. My parents. The second my dad's car pulled into the driveway, I looked back toward the end of the block. The figure was gone. Not walking away. Not running. Just gone. I ran downstairs before my parents even made it to the front door. The second they came inside, I started telling them everything. The knocking, someone calling my name, looking outside over and over without seeing anyone, and finally the figure standing down the street. My dad grabbed a flashlight, and the 3 of us checked the entire house together. Every room, every closet, every window, every door, everything was locked. There was no sign that anyone had been inside the house. For a moment, I actually started wondering if maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me. Then we walked into the kitchen. A ceramic plate was lying on the floor, shattered into pieces. The strange part was, I knew that plate hadn't been there earlier. When I thought I'd heard something downstairs and checked the kitchen, everything was exactly where it should have been. Nothing was broken. Now somehow, that plate was in pieces. None of us could explain it. To this day, I still don't know who or what was outside my house that night. Maybe there was a simple explanation for everything. Maybe there wasn't. All I know is that I've watched horror movies by myself more times than I can count, but after that night, I never watched one alone again. Before we move on to the next story, I want to ask you something. If you were completely alone, someone kept knocking on your front door, called your name, and every time you looked outside, nobody was there, would you have stayed inside, or would you have opened the door? Let me know what you would have done in the comments. This story was shared by a Reddit user named Emily. This happened late last summer. My name's Emily, I'm 19, and this is probably the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. I've never really been afraid of staying home alone. If anything, I actually liked it. The house was always quiet, and it gave me a chance to get things done without anyone bothering me. That's exactly what I thought I was going to do that afternoon. My mom was at work, and my dad was out of town for a couple of days, so I had the whole house to myself. It was a little after 2 in the afternoon, but if you looked outside, you'd think it was almost evening. Thick black storm clouds had covered the sky, blocking out almost all the sunlight. The entire house had this dull gray look to it, and I ended up turning on the lights in the living room and hallway because some rooms felt way darker than they should have. Every now and then I'd hear thunder somewhere in the distance. It hadn't started raining yet, but it definitely felt like a storm was about to hit. I was sitting at the dining room table with my laptop open, trying to finish a college assignment. I had my headphones on with some music playing quietly in the background, and for a while everything felt completely normal. I was so focused on my work that I didn't even realize how quiet the house had gotten. For some reason, I suddenly felt this weird urge to take my headphones off. I can't really explain why. It was just one of those feelings you get for no reason at all. The second I pulled them off, the silence hit me immediately. The whole house felt unnaturally still. That's when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. They weren't loud, and they weren't fast. It sounded like someone was casually walking through the upstairs hallway, one slow step after another. I stopped typing and listened without moving. After a few seconds, the footsteps suddenly stopped. I waited, expecting to hear them again, but the house went completely silent. I remember telling myself it was probably nothing. Older houses make weird noises all the time, especially when the weather changes. That explanation made enough sense, so I took a deep breath, put my hands back on the keyboard, and tried to finish my assignment. But after hearing those footsteps, I couldn't stop glancing toward the staircase. I tried to keep working, but my mind wasn't on the assignment anymore. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself looking toward the staircase, almost expecting to hear those footsteps again. The house stayed completely quiet, and after about 10 minutes, I finally convinced myself I'd just let the weather mess with my head. I got up to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. I wasn't gone long, maybe a minute, maybe two. When I walked back into the dining room, the first thing I noticed was my laptop. Something wasn't right. My assignment wasn't on the screen anymore. Instead, there was a blank document open. At first, I honestly thought I'd clicked on the wrong file before walking away. I set my glass down, stepped closer, and reached for the mouse. That's when I saw it. There was only one sentence typed in the middle of the screen. "You're not alone." I just froze. My heart started pounding so hard I could actually hear it. I knew exactly what had been on my screen before I walked into the kitchen, and it definitely wasn't this. I was the only person in the house. No one could have walked in without me hearing them, and no one else had access to my laptop. For a second, I even wondered if one of my friends was somehow messing with me remotely, but that didn't make any sense either. The storm had been knocking our Wi-Fi offline all afternoon. Half the time, there wasn't even an internet connection. I slowly looked around the room. The living room was empty. The hallway was empty. The kitchen behind me was empty. Everything looked exactly the way it had a couple of minutes earlier. But something had changed. I could feel it. For the first time that day, I honestly didn't feel like I was home alone anymore. I stood there for another few seconds, just staring at the screen, hoping I'd somehow realize there was a logical explanation for it. But the longer I looked at those words, the worse that feeling in my stomach got. I finally closed the document and tried to reopen my assignment, but I couldn't focus anymore. My hands were on the keyboard, yet I wasn't typing a single word. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. A loud crack of thunder suddenly shook the whole house, and almost immediately the rain started pouring. Within seconds, it was coming down so hard that I could barely see through the windows. The house got even darker, so I walked into the living room and turned on another light, hoping it'd make me feel a little less on edge. As I walked back toward the dining room, something caught my attention near the staircase. For just a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the end of the upstairs hallway. I stopped immediately and stared in that direction. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I stayed there for a few more seconds, hoping my eyes were just playing tricks on me. Between the storm outside and the shadows inside the house, I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. But no matter how hard I tried to calm myself down, that uneasy feeling just kept getting stronger. I finally called my mom and told her something didn't feel right. I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding crazy, so I just told her I'd been hearing strange noises and I was starting to get scared. She could hear it in my voice. Without asking any questions, she told me she was leaving work right away and said, "Just stay downstairs and don't go upstairs until I get home." After we hung up, I looked back at my laptop. The blank document was still open, but the message was gone. It was like those words had never been there at all. My mom got home about 25 minutes later, but honestly, it felt a lot longer than that. I stayed near the front door the entire time. I didn't go upstairs, I didn't touch my laptop again, and I barely took my eyes off the staircase. Every little sound made me look up, expecting to see someone standing there. The second my mom pulled into the driveway, I felt like I could finally breathe again. As soon as she walked inside, I told her everything from the beginning. The footsteps upstairs, the message on my laptop, and how it had disappeared before she got there. I knew how crazy it sounded, but I also knew I hadn't imagined it. She tried to stay calm, but she could tell I was genuinely shaken. Together, we searched the entire house. We checked every bedroom, every closet, every bathroom, and every window. We even looked in the garage. Everything was exactly the way it should have been. Every door was locked. Every window was locked. There wasn't a single sign that anyone had been inside the house. For a minute, I actually started wondering if maybe stress and the storm had gotten the best of me. I was almost ready to let it go, until we walked upstairs. My mom suddenly stopped in the hallway and looked toward the window at the end of it. She turned to me and asked Emily, "Did you open that window?" I looked over and my stomach dropped. The hallway window was halfway open. That window was never open. I knew it had been locked earlier that day, and my mom said the same thing. She walked over, pulled it shut, and checked the lock. It was still locked. Neither of us could explain how a locked window had somehow been sitting halfway open. To this day, I still don't know what I heard upstairs, who wrote that message, or how that window ended up open. All I know is, whenever the sky turns dark in the middle of the day and storm clouds roll in, I never stay home alone anymore. Before we get into the last story, I have a question for you. If you came back to your room and something had clearly been moved, but you knew you were home alone, what would you do? Let me know in the comments, because in the next story, things don't just make noise, they start moving on their own. This story was shared by a Reddit user named Jason. This happened back in February. My name's Jason. I'm 20 years old, and I've always been the kind of person who likes having the house to myself. Earlier this year, my parents went out for their anniversary dinner, and I figured I'd spend the evening in my room getting some editing done on my PC. Nothing unusual, just a quiet night by myself. I keep my desk ridiculously organized. My phone always sits on the left side of my keyboard, my keys stay next to my monitor, and everything else has its own spot. I know that probably sounds a little obsessive, but that's just how I've always been. If something's out of place, I notice it almost immediately. A couple of hours went by without anything weird happening. I was focused on editing, occasionally checking my phone, and honestly, I was having a pretty relaxing night. At one point, I got up to use the bathroom. I was gone for less than a minute. When I came back into my room, I immediately stopped walking. My phone wasn't where I'd left it. It was sitting on the other side of my desk. I just stood there staring at it for a second. I was almost positive I'd left it next to my keyboard, but then I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I'd moved it without thinking. Maybe I was just tired and didn't remember. I picked it up, put it back where it always goes, and tried to laugh it off. At the time, I had no idea that was only the first thing that was going to move. I went back to editing and eventually stopped thinking about it. The more I replayed it in my head, the more I convinced myself I'd probably moved my phone without realizing it. It honestly didn't seem like a big deal anymore. About 20 minutes later, I got up again to grab the charger from the hallway because my phone was almost dead. I was out of my room for maybe 30 seconds. When I walked back in, something immediately felt off. I couldn't figure out what it was at first. Then I noticed my chair. It wasn't facing my desk anymore. It was turned almost completely toward the bedroom door, like someone had been sitting in it, looking out into the hallway. I just stood there. I know that chair had been pushed in before I left. I always push it back under my desk because I hate leaving it in the middle of the room. I walked over, grabbed the back of the chair, and looked around the room. Everything else looked normal. My closet door was closed. My bedroom window was locked. Nothing looked out of place except that chair. I even laughed to myself and said, "Okay, now I'm definitely losing it." I turned the chair back toward my desk, sat down, and tried to get back to work. But this time, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder every few seconds. At that point, I wasn't even trying to convince myself anymore. Two things had already been out of place, and both times I'd found an excuse for it. But now, I wanted to know if I was actually forgetting things, or if something else was going on. So before I started editing again, I took my car keys out of my pocket and placed them right next to my keyboard. Then I pulled out my phone, took a picture of my desk, and set the phone back down. I remember thinking, if those keys move again, at least I'll know I'm not imagining it. I stayed in my chair the whole time. I never left my room. I kept editing for another 15 or 20 minutes, and every now and then I'd glance at the keys just to make sure they were still there. Eventually, I reached over to grab my water bottle from the floor beside my desk. It couldn't have taken more than 2 or 3 seconds. When I looked back, the keys were gone. I froze. I didn't panic right away. I actually thought maybe they'd fallen off the desk somehow. I checked under the chair, under the desk, even behind my PC tower. They weren't anywhere. Then, I slowly looked across the room. My keys were sitting on my bed, right in the middle of the blanket. I didn't touch them. I just stared at them. I'd been alone in that room the entire time. The bedroom door had never opened, and I hadn't heard a single sound. There was no logical way those keys could have ended up on my bed. That was the moment I stopped trying to explain it. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. My dad answered on the second ring. The moment he heard my voice, he knew something was wrong. I told him everything. My phone showing up in a different spot, my chair somehow turning toward the door, and my keys ending up on my bed even though I'd never left the room. He didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, he simply said, "Stay where you are. We'll be home as soon as we can." After the call, I didn't go anywhere. I left the keys exactly where they were, sat down on the edge of my bed, and kept staring at my bedroom door. I wasn't editing anymore. I wasn't even looking at my computer. I just wanted to hear my parents walk through the front door. When they finally got home, I showed my dad the picture I'd taken earlier. You could clearly see my keys sitting beside the keyboard. Then I pointed to my bed, where they'd somehow ended up. The three of us searched every room in the house, checked every closet, every window, and every door. Everything was locked. Everything looked completely normal. There wasn't a single sign that anyone had been inside. My dad looked at the picture one more time before handing my phone back to me. He said maybe I moved the keys without realizing it, but even he didn't sound convinced. I still have that picture saved on my phone. Every time I look at it, I remember exactly where those keys were supposed to be. And I know I never moved them. If you enjoyed these stories and you're still in the mood for more, click the video that's on your screen right now. It's another collection of true Home Alone horror stories that are just as unsettling as these. And if you don't want to miss future uploads, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.